Every judge of Israel explained: heroes, failures, and deliverers. You have probably heard the highlight reel: a woman leading an army, a shepherd defeating thousands with a trumpet and a jar, a strong man tearing a lion apart with his bare hands. Flannel graph heroes, larger than life, standing in for a golden age of faith before the kings showed up and ruined everything. But the actual book of Judges tells a very different and far darker story. It is not a highlight reel of spiritual giants. It is the record of a nation trapped in a brutal, repeating cycle, rescued again and again, not because it deserved rescue, but because God kept showing up anyway, and the people He used to do it were almost never the ones you would expect. The book opens with Israel already sliding. Joshua is dead. The generation that watched the Jordan River part and the walls of Jericho fall has died with him. And Judges chapter 2, verse 10, delivers the line that explains everything that follows. There arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which He had done for Israel. From there, the whole book runs on a single repeating cycle, 4 beats that show up again and again for roughly 300 years. Israel sins, usually by worshiping the gods of the nations around them. God allows a foreign power to oppress and enslave them. The people finally cry out for help. And God raises up a deliverer, a judge, who rescues them, after which the land has peace for a while, until the next generation forgets all over again, and the cycle starts over. The book ends with a sentence that tells you everything about the state Israel was actually in by the time this era closes. Judges chapter 21, verse 25, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That is the world these judges were operating in. Not a golden age, a slow-motion collapse, interrupted again and again by unlikely rescuers. Let us meet them in order, starting with the men who set the pattern for everyone who came after them. The first deliverers. Israel's very first judge is a man named Othniel, and his story in Judges chapter 3 is short, almost to the point of being a template. Deliberately simple so you can see the whole 4-beat cycle clearly before the book starts complicating it. His name likely means Lion of God, and he is already a proven warrior, having captured a city for Caleb earlier in Joshua's conquest and married Caleb's daughter Achsah as a reward. When Israel falls under the oppression of a Mesopotamian king for 8 years, Judges chapter 3, verse 9, says the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a deliverer, Othniel. He defeats the oppressor, and the land has rest for 40 years. No complications, no doubt, no tragic flaw. Othniel is the pattern the rest of the book will spend its remaining chapters complicating. Because the very next judge already breaks the mold. Ehud, whose name means union or strength, is introduced in Judges chapter 3 with a detail Scripture rarely bothers to mention about anyone. He was left-handed, a trait that becomes the key to the entire plan. Israel has spent 18 years paying tribute to an enormously fat Moabite king named Eglon, and Ehud is sent to deliver the tribute personally. He straps a short sword to his right thigh, the opposite side a guard would normally search on a right-handed man, gains a private audience by claiming he has a secret message from God, and Judges chapter 3, verse 21 describes what happens next. Without flinching, Ehud reached with his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. It is one of the most graphic scenes in the entire Old Testament, and it is followed by Ehud calmly locking the door behind him and walking out past confused servants, who wait outside for so long, assuming their king is simply using the bathroom, that Ehud is already well on his way to rally an army, by the time anyone works up the nerve to force the door open and find him. Israel then has rest for 80 years, the longest peace in the whole book. Right after Ehud, Judges chapter 3, verse 31, gives us one sentence about a judge named Shamgar, who killed 600 Philistines with nothing but an ox goad, a farming tool for prodding cattle. That is the entire account. One verse. Sometimes deliverance in this book does not come with a biography at all. Just proof that God can use whatever happens to be sitting in your hand. The unlikely leaders. The pattern breaks even further with the next judge, because for the first time, God raises up a woman. Deborah's name means bee, and Judges chapter 4, verse 4, introduces her doing two things at once. She was a prophetess, and she was judging Israel, sitting under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel while people came to her for decisions. In a period defined by moral chaos, Deborah is a figure of remarkable clarity and authority. Jewish tradition would later count her among only a handful of recognized prophetesses in the entire Hebrew Bible. When it comes time to fight against a Canaanite army commanded by a general named Sisera, who has 900 iron chariots, Deborah summons a man named Barak, whose own name means lightning, and tells him God has commanded him to lead the assault. Barak's answer in Judges chapter 4, verse 8, is startling for someone named Lightning. If you go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. He will not move without her. Deborah agrees to go, but tells him plainly that because of his hesitation, the honor of the coming victory will go to a woman instead of to him. That woman turns out not to be Deborah herself, but a tent-dwelling woman named Jael, who, after the battle is won and Sisera flees to hide in her tent, drives a tent peg through his temple while he sleeps, fulfilling the prophecy in the most unexpected way possible. Deborah and Barak's victory song in Judges chapter 5 is considered one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the entire Bible. Written in an archaic style scholars believe was composed extremely close to the actual events it describes. The song does not flatter every tribe equally. It praises the ones who showed up to fight, and pointedly calls out Reuben, Dan, and Asher for staying home among their sheep and ships instead of joining the battle. A reminder that this deliverance, like most in this book, was not a unanimous national effort, but the work of whoever was actually willing to answer the call. And the song lingers longest, almost gleefully, on Jael's kill, describing in verse after verse exactly how Sisera fell at her feet, dead. It celebrates a battle won not by Israel's strongest warrior, but by a prophetess who would not let a hesitant general off the hook, and a woman with a tent peg who was never a soldier at all. Then comes Gideon, whose name means hacker or feller, as in one who cuts things down, and whose story in Judges chapters 6 through 8 is the most detailed and most human of any judge we will cover. When the angel of the Lord finds him, Gideon is not leading an army. He is threshing wheat inside a winepress, hiding the grain from raiding Midianites who have been stripping Israel's harvests for 7 years. The angel's greeting in Judges chapter 6, verse 12, is almost sarcastic given the circumstances. "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." Gideon's response is not confidence, it is a list of complaints. If the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And when God tells him to save Israel, Gideon's reply in verse 15 is a master class in self-deprecation. "My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." Gideon asks for sign after sign, most famously the fleece, laying wool on the ground and asking God to make it wet with dew while the ground around it stays dry, and then reversing the test the next night just to be sure. God patiently grants every single request. And then, right when Gideon finally has an army of 32,000 men, God does something that seems designed to test faith rather than build it. He tells Gideon the army is too large because Israel might claim the victory was won by its own strength rather than by God's. Judges chapter 7, verse 2. Lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, My own hand has saved me. Through 2 separate rounds of thinning, the army shrinks from 32,000 down to just 300 men, selected by the strange method of how they drink water from a stream. With torches, trumpets, and empty jars instead of swords, those 300 men rout the entire Midianite camp in the middle of the night. And Gideon becomes, for a moment, the most successful military leader Israel has seen since Joshua. But success curdles quickly. When the people ask him to become their king, Gideon gives an answer that sounds righteous on the surface. Judges chapter 8, verse 23. I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. And yet in the very next verse, he requests gold earrings from the plunder and fashions them into a golden ephod that Judges chapter 8, verse 27 says all Israel played the harlot with, meaning the very man who refused a crown quietly builds an idol that leads the nation right back into the sin he was raised up to end. Gideon's refusal of the crown does not settle the question for long, because one of his own sons decides to answer it himself, by force. Abimelech, whose name means, with brutal irony, "My father is king," is born to Gideon and a concubine from Shechem. And after Gideon's death, Judges chapter 9 tells us Abimelech convinces the leaders of Shechem to fund him. And he uses that money to hire reckless, worthless men and murder 69 of his own brothers on a single stone, leaving only the youngest, Jotham, alive by hiding. Jotham responds with a biting parable, standing on a mountainside shouting down at the men of Shechem, comparing them to trees so desperate for a king that they finally settle for a thorn bush, the one plant useless enough that none of the productive trees wanted the job. Abimelech's violent 3-year reign ends almost as abruptly as it began, when a woman drops a millstone from a tower onto his head during a siege, crushing his skull. And Abimelech, unwilling to let it be said he was killed by a woman, orders his own armor-bearer to run him through with a sword instead. Abimelech is not counted among the official judges of Israel, and that omission is the point. He is what happens when someone tries to seize the crown through violence, rather than wait for God to raise up a deliverer in his own timing. And his brief, bloody reign is Scripture's way of warning you, well before the book's final refrain about a king, exactly what an unauthorized one looks like. If uncovering the real story behind these familiar names is helping you see the Book of Judges differently, the best thing you can do is subscribe and drop a comment below. Even just a word helps, and share it with someone who might find it encouraging. The minor judges and the tragic vow. After Gideon, the book gives us a run of judges who receive only the briefest mention, and their obscurity is its own kind of lesson. Tola, whose name means worm or scarlet, judges Israel for 23 years, and Judges chapter 10, verse 1 tells us almost nothing else about him except where he lived and where he was buried. Jair follows him, remembered mainly for having 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys and controlled 30 towns, a small footnote of prosperity in the middle of a chaotic era. You do not have to be famous to be faithful, and these men prove that some deliverers simply held the line quietly for a season and let the peace they secured speak for itself. Judges chapter 10 verse 2 tells us Tola rose to save Israel after a period of crisis. The text does not even bother to describe in detail, as if the rescue itself mattered more to the author than the disaster it answered. Jair's 30 sons on 30 donkeys ruling 30 towns, described in Judges chapter 10 verse 4, is a small, almost domestic picture of stability, the kind of quiet, distributed leadership that never produces a single dramatic battle scene but still counts in this book as 22 years of peace worth recording by name. Then Israel sins again, worse than before, and the oppression that follows is severe enough that when the people cry out, God's initial response in Judges chapter 10, verse 13, is almost weary. You have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore I will deliver you no more. Only after Israel actually puts away its foreign gods does God relent. And the deliverer he raises up is one of the most tragic figures in the entire book. Jephthah, whose name means he opens or he releases, is introduced in Judges chapter 11 as the son of a prostitute, driven out of his own family by his half-brothers and denied any inheritance. He becomes the leader of a band of outcasts in the land of Tob, and it is precisely because of his reputation as a fighter that the very elders who once expelled him come begging for his help against the invading Ammonites. Jephthah negotiates skillfully and even attempts real diplomacy before resorting to war, laying out a detailed historical and legal argument to the Ammonite king in Judges chapter 11 that most military leaders in this book never bother with. But right before the battle, Jephthah makes a vow that will define the rest of his life and dogs it forever. Judges chapter 11, verse 31, Whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. He wins the battle decisively, and then he comes home, and the first thing to come out of his door is his own daughter, dancing with tambourines to celebrate her father's victory. Judges chapter 11, verse 35, When he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. Scholars have debated for centuries exactly what Jephthah does next, whether he literally offers his daughter as a sacrifice or dedicates her to a lifetime of service and perpetual virginity. But either reading describes a devastating loss, and the text tells us that for 4 days every year afterward, the young women of Israel would go out to lament her. Jephthah's story is a warning wrapped inside a victory, that a reckless promise made in a moment of desperate bargaining can cost you the very thing you were fighting to protect. 3 more minor judges follow in quick succession, given only a few verses each. Ibzan of Bethlehem, remembered for his 30 sons and 30 daughters. Elon the Zebulunite, remembered mainly for how long he judged and where he was buried. Abdon, remembered for 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. None of them get a dramatic battle scene. All of them are named anyway, which tells you something about how this book keeps score. Faithfulness is worth recording even when it never makes headlines. The final judge, which brings us to the last, longest, and strangest judge in the entire book, a man whose name, Shimshon, likely comes from the Hebrew word for son. Samson's story, in Judges chapters 13 through 16, begins before he is even born, when an angel appears to his previously barren mother and tells her the son she will have must be raised as a Nazirite from the womb, set apart to God, under a strict vow that includes never cutting his hair. Judges chapter 13, verse 5, No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Samson is given supernatural strength, And Scripture makes clear it comes directly from the Spirit of the Lord coming upon him, not from his hair itself. The hair is simply the visible sign of a vow he keeps breaking in every other way. He kills a lion with his bare hands. He slaughters 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He carries the entire gate of the city of Gaza on his shoulders up a hillside after being trapped inside for the night. But alongside every act of supernatural strength is an act of shocking impulsiveness. He marries a Philistine woman against his parents' explicit objection, purely, Judges chapter 14, verse 3 tells us, because she pleased him well. At his own wedding feast, he turns a private encounter with a lion's carcass, where he found a swarm of bees and honey inside its bones, into a riddle wagered against 30 sets of clothing. And when his new wife wheedles the answer out of him under pressure from her own countrymen, Samson pays his bet by killing 30 men in another town and taking their clothes, then storms off without her. When he later discovers she has been given to someone else, he catches 300 foxes, ties them tail to tail in pairs with torches between them, and sends them running through the Philistines' grain fields, olive groves, and vineyards, burning an entire harvest to the ground in retaliation. A wildly destructive act of personal revenge, dressed up as deliverance. He visits prostitutes. He toys repeatedly with the one vow that actually matters, telling 3 separate lies to a woman named Delilah about the source of his strength, seemingly enjoying the game even as her Philistine handlers hide in the next room waiting to capture him. And then, worn down by her nagging, Judges chapter 16, verse 17, he told her all his heart, and said to her, "No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaven, then my strength would leave me." She shaves his head while he sleeps. And Judges chapter 16, verse 20, delivers one of the most chilling lines in the Bible. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Blinded, chained, and put to work grinding grain like an animal, Samson becomes a public spectacle for the very people he was raised up to defeat. But the final scene of his life is also the most consequential. Brought out to entertain the Philistine lords at a festival, Samson, his hair having quietly grown back, prays one last prayer. Judges chapter 16, verse 28. "O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once." Pushing apart the 2 central pillars of the temple, he brings the entire building down, killing more Philistines in his death than he had killed in his entire life. Samson's story is not a clean hero's arc. It is the story of a man whose greatest strength and greatest weakness were often the exact same impulsiveness, a deliverer who spent his life chasing what he wanted and still, somehow, in the end, accomplished exactly what God had set him apart to do. Judges technically ends after Samson's death, but the era of the Judges does not fully close until 2 more names finish out the story, bridging directly into the Age of Kings. Eli, an aging priest at the tabernacle in Shiloh, functions as Israel's judge for 40 years, but his own sons abuse their priestly office so badly that 1 Samuel chapter 2 describes them treating the Lord's offerings with contempt, and Eli, though he rebukes them, never actually removes them from office. When the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant itself, and Eli hears the news, 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 18, records that he fell backward off his seat and died, an old judge undone in the end, not by an enemy army, but by his own failure to restrain his family. It is Eli who raises the boy given to him by a woman named Hannah. And that boy, Samuel, becomes the last of the judges and the first of the great prophets, the one who will eventually anoint both of Israel's first 2 kings, closing the era we have just walked through and opening the very story we have already told in previous videos. So what does this strange, often unsettling collection of deliverers actually tell us? Three things stand out, the same three threads running underneath every single name we have covered today. First, God's rescue was never dependent on the character of the rescuer. Ehud was a calculated assassin. Gideon was a doubt-riddled skeptic who built an idol with his own victory spoils. Jephthah was an outcast who made a vow he never should have made. Samson broke nearly every commitment he was born under. And yet every single one of them delivered Israel exactly as God intended. The power was never coming from their own moral consistency. It was coming from the God who kept choosing to work through deeply flawed people anyway. Second, the cycle itself is the real main character of this book, more than any individual judge. Sin, oppression, crying out, deliverance, peace, and then forgetting all over again. Judges is not really 12 or so separate action stories stitched together. It is one long demonstration of just how quickly a rescued people can drift right back into the exact trouble they were just rescued from, and how patient God is willing to be, cycle after cycle, judge after judge, refusing to finally abandon a nation that kept abandoning him first. And third, notice how the book gets darker, not lighter, as it goes. Othniel's story is clean and simple. By the time you reach Samson, you are watching a judge whose personal life is a genuine mess, chosen before birth and still somehow squandering nearly every advantage he was given. And in between, you get Abimelech, a man who never waited for God to raise him up at all, and simply took what he wanted through slaughter. That downward trajectory is not an accident. It is the author of Judges quietly building the case for exactly the sentence the book ends on, that a people with no king, answering to nothing but their own eyes, cannot hold itself together forever, no matter how many deliverers God sends. Which is really what the title of this video is getting at. Heroes, failures, and deliverers were almost never three different categories of people in the book of Judges. They were usually the very same person, sometimes within the space of a single chapter. Gideon delivers an entire nation with 300 men and a handful of trumpets, and then, within a few verses, hands that same nation an idol to worship. Jephthah negotiates peace like a seasoned diplomat, and then destroys his own family with a careless vow. Samson accomplishes more against Israel's enemies in his death than in his life. The judges were never the final answer. They were proof that Israel desperately needed one, and a long, patient setup for the throne that was still to come. If this was meaningful for you, the biggest thing you can do to support this channel is to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone else. That is genuinely how people find this content.